how did the Yamnaya conquer Europe? So, what's a problem with people who live on farms? What's their ultimate problem? Thank you, the plague, okay? Do you understand? Because you're living next to pigs and rats, and there's a lot of garbage around, okay? So it's very easy for diseases to spread, okay? So we believe two things happen to reduce the population of Europe significantly. The first thing that happened was the plague. Okay? And this wiped out entire communities. Now the thing is, though, the plague spread around the world. Okay? Because remember, what's important to remember is these people in the steppes, in the Near East, in Europe, were all in contact with each other because they were trading with each other. Okay? So the plague, we know from DNA research, was in Europe, the Near East, and the steppes. Why did it wipe out the population of Europe, but not the population of the steppes, even though the plague was everywhere? The answer is because the people in Europe were living in one place, right? Whereas the people of the steppes were moving from place to place. Does it make sense? So even though the plague did impact the people in the steppes, the impact was far greater in Europe. In fact, we believe that most of the people were wiped out by the plague in Europe, okay? So that reduced the population significantly, okay? So that's the first thing that happened in Europe. Second thing that happened in Europe is what we call climate change. So about let me do the math. About 5,000, 6,000 years ago, there was a mini ice age in Europe. And if you're a farmer, that's really bad for you, okay? Because you can't grow crops. And it's bad for you if you live in the steppes because a lot of your crops will die, but not as bad, okay? And the other thing is that now, the ice age, because of climate change, people in the steppes are now forced to expand further into Europe, okay? So this is what we think happened. Three things, okay, that destroyed Europe. The first thing is the plague. That's actually the most important thing because it wiped out most of the people. Okay? So think of when Europe conquered North and South America. What killed most people in North and South America was actually the plague, right? Europeans had these diseases they brought over, and that killed most of the local population. Okay? So the plague was the main culprit that destroyed all Europe. Then climate change, and then finally the Yamnaya people who came into Europe and started to colonize Europe and destroy the local population. Okay? So let me now explain why the Yamnaya decided to kill the people, the farmers of Europe. Okay? So let's just say that in Europe you have a village, maybe 100 men, 100 women. You're the Yamnaya, you have 100 men, young men who have no wealth and no wives, okay? So what do they want to do? If you're a young man, you have no wife, and you have no wealth, what do you want to do? Yeah, you want to steal other people's wife and property, right? So they came in, okay? So, and what do they do? You have 100 men and 100 women in this village. So what do? No, yeah, but yeah, they killed the men, okay, guys? Okay? And then they married all the women. And that's what happened, okay? Now, there are some circumstances when the Yamnaya came in, because again, this is a culture. This is not one people. It's a culture of people. And they adopted different strategies. Some of them just had to come in and said, listen, we'll take all the women and we'll let the men go. And what did these men do in return, in response? What would you do? Yeah, so they went to get their neighbors, got 1,000 of them, came back and killed everyone. Okay? So this was actually a violent process with violence on both sides. Okay? But eventually, what happened was the Yamnaya conquered all of Europe. Okay? And they even got to England. They conquered England. Okay? And then, not only did they conquer Europe, then they went to conquer India and Iran. So this spread everywhere. And even Mongolia, okay? But not to China. Why didn't it impact China? What are the reasons why the Yamnaya could not conquer China? What's between India and China? They conquered India, right? Why could they conquer China? You can't, if you have horses, okay? You can't cross the Himalayas, okay? So that's what saved China, the geography. Also, China had a huge population, right? So even if the Yamnaya came, the population could have repulsed the attack, okay? But China was not conquered by the Yamnaya. So China, for most of its history, was isolated from the rest of the world. Okay? Does that make sense? So, but this conquest meant now there's a common language among all these people in India, in Iran, in the steppes, basically Russia, in the Near East, and in Europe. Okay? This language is what we call Proto-Indo-European. That's a language they spoke. Okay? Now they have a common religion. So from this point on, this world, okay, stretching from Europe all the way to India, was in constant communication with each other, trading ideas, people, and gods. Okay, and this is what we call today the West. Okay, and it's distinct from China, which was isolated from this world. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, any questions? Yeah?
The Yamnaya people are the people who formed the Mongolian Empire?
The Mongolian people are descended from the Yamnaya, yes. And if you think about it, the Mongolian people are very similar to the Yamnaya, right? The Mongolians are also nomadic pastoral people who are also very much warlike, okay? And in fact, what we'll learn later on is that Genghis Khan adopted very similar policies as the Yamnaya. Okay? So we'll see a lot of similarities between Genghis Khan and his conquest and the Yamnaya conquest of the world at this time, about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Yes?
I kind of want to ask about the disease.
The plague, yes.
Okay, so that kills like most of but that didn't kill the Europeans.
It killed most Europeans, yes. Because Europeans were living on farms, right? So they were living together.
Okay, so that's why the Maya people could go to that place.
Yeah, because it reduced the population of Europe, so they were less able to resist the invasion.
But why is the Maya people doesn't get killed by the disease?
Okay, all right. So the plague was all around the world, okay? And this is actually the bubonic plague, okay? The bubonic plague. It's spread by rats. And we have DNA of this plague, okay? So we know the bubonic plague has been with us for the longest time, okay? So the plague kills people who live closely together. Do you understand?
Closely together.
Because then it's easier to transmit the disease. Okay? So if you live closely together, you're much more likely to catch the disease and die. Does it make sense? But if you live far apart, then you're less likely to catch the disease. So in Europe, people were living on farms. And there's like 10,000 people who might live on a farm, okay? That's a lot of people who live very closely together. They're also living with animals. So So it's very unclean. But if you're living in the steppes, okay, first of all, you're living far apart. That's the first thing. Second thing is your life is much more hygienic, okay? Because you're not living with pigs and rats. And the third thing is your body is a lot stronger because you're drinking milk, okay? You're getting a lot of physical exercise. Does that make sense? Yeah. So these people are less likely to die from the plague. All right. Any more questions?
Yeah, so are the Greeks the descendants of the Yamnaya?
Exactly, yes. Okay. So basically, everyone in Europe, except for a few people, are the descendants of the Yamnaya. Okay? The Indian people, the Iranian people, also consider descendants of the Yamnaya. Now, when the Yamnaya came, these farmers in Europe, okay, there were maybe 3 major responses. Okay, the first response is let's fight them, and then they got killed. The second response is let's try to cooperate with them. Okay, and the third major response is let's move somewhere else. So the people who moved to islands. Okay, so for example, there's an island called Sardinia. Okay, in Italy. Okay, it's an island. They survived against the Yamnaya, and they have less Yamnaya DNA than other people, okay? But if you can't run off to an island, you're going to get wiped out, okay? But basically, all of Europe was conquered by the Yamnaya. And when you look at the and later on, I will show you the DNA evidence. When you look at that evidence, it's pretty stark, okay? All right?
How did they conquer England?
That's a great question, okay? Thank you. All right. So this process took a long time, hundreds of years, okay? And during this time, this is a spread of a culture. So it's not one people, it's not one nation. So what's happening was, as they conquered different territories, they had to adapt themselves to that territory because the geography is different, okay? So in the steppes, you're leading a nomadic pastoral lifestyle. And at first, they tried that. So for example, we have evidence that in Norway, which is in North Europe, they burned down all the forests because they were trying to replicate their homeland, okay? But then eventually they discovered this is not going to work, okay? It's too hard. So then they started to mix their lifestyle with a local lifestyle, and they became more focused on agriculture, okay? Does that make sense? All right. And as they kept on spreading, they also stole the technology of the local people. So even though the Yamnaya people had no shipbuilding technology, they couldn't sail the seas, they were able to conquer people here off the coast who did have access to the sea and who did have boats, okay? And then they stole the technology. They killed the people and they learned the technology, okay? Once they had the technology, then they sailed off to England and killed everyone in England. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's a very slow process. And these are different groups of Yamnaya. Okay? Okay, but that's a very good question. Any more questions? Are you guys clear about this? Okay? All right. Absolutely clear? Okay, good. So when we come back from the break, okay, we will discuss the new world that this creates. Okay, because when you think of Western civilization, the Greeks, the Romans, well, they all come from this world, okay? So basically, what the Yamnaya do is they create a new history for humanity. Before the Yamnaya, humans were egalitarian, peaceful, and artistic, okay? And now, with the Yamnaya, you have patriarchy, you have war, you have money. But before, we didn't have these concepts. So this marks a new history for humanity. When we come back from the break, we'll start exploring this history.